Welcome to the Evelyn Y. Davis Studios at the National Press Foundation. Coming up, we'll talk with Washington Post political writer Melinda Henneberger about her list of the 5 most interesting Washington people for 2015. The National Press Foundation is a nonprofit dedicated to helping journalists cover complex topics with depth and accuracy. Our mission includes journalists around the U.S. and around the world. I'm Linda Topping-Streitfeld, Director of Programs at the National Press Foundation, and I'm here with Melinda Henneberger, a political writer for the Washington Post and the anchor writer of the paper's She the People blog. Melinda, welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me.
It's great to have you here today.
Thank you.
I think we've given you a really impossible task. We have
to see into the future?
Well, that too. But here we've got so much pomp and personality in Washington to try to tease out the 5 most interesting seems almost impossible.
And we never go awry when we make predictions here, right?
That's right, but we promise we're not going to next year play this back to see how you did.
That's good.
Who was first on your list?
Really one of the most interesting stories I saw this year about someone that not a lot of people had heard about is a young woman, 16 years old, named Serena Camilla. Now,
16 years old.
16 years old.
A teenager at the top of your list.
I do.
I can't wait to hear about
This is an
her.
amazing story. So Serena is on the board of the Montgomery County Democratic Party's Planning Commission. She's been involved in several political campaigns. She's being homeschooled, but really she's homeschooling herself. She's a high school junior, and she's an honor student at the University of Maryland, all this while also being homeless.
Now that's the key to what really makes her fascinating.
To define the statistics. So this young woman, her mother, who has a couple of advanced degrees, had lost her job, been laid off last year, became clinically depressed after that happened. They lost their home. The family ended up filing for bankruptcy, and all through this, Serena is, just continuing to excel in school and out, being very involved. And her political involvement, I think, is so inspiring at a time when so many people, not just young people, but of all ages, really turned off to politics. I just find it really inspiring that she continues to believe in the system and to believe that change is possible, and says that she wants to go on to become a civil rights attorney.
That is a great story. And it's the kind of story we love to hear at the holidays, especially. I wonder, when you hear a story about a homeless person like her, who has managed to, this is the quintessential bootstrap story, right? Despite everything, she's managing to be involved, to accomplish things, to move herself and her mother forward. Do we risk, when we hear a story like that, expecting all homeless people to be just as accomplished? Is there a part of that story that says, okay, maybe I don't have to make as big a contribution to homeless people this Christmas because...
That's a really great question, because unlike a lot of people in that situation, they have a lot of resources in that this young woman is so exceptional and has been recognized academically in other ways as such that they were briefly sleeping in their car in a park somewhere, watching coyotes dart in and out of the woods. And very soon, one of the candidates that she had been volunteering for actually took she and her mom into their home. So also, having a lot of education, not having an absence of addiction or domestic violence or some other complicating factor that really does make it a lot harder for a lot of people in that situation to get out of it. So that's a really important question. Thanks.
Still an amazing young woman.
Very much so.
What do you think is ahead for her in 2015? You mentioned that she's not only homeschooling herself in high school, but she also goes to University of Maryland. So she's
Right.
doing a sort of dual enrollment
That's right.
kind of thing.
And she's not eligible when you're doing this program when you're still in high school and also studying in the University of Maryland. You're not actually eligible for financial aid. So she's meanwhile also fundraising online to fund her own education. So I see that someone with that kind of resilience, I just see good things ahead for her in the next year.
Right. I'm sure you're right. And that's one that I think we will want to watch for sure. But she won't be running for president. No? Okay.
No.
But that may bring us to
She may.
the next name on your list.
Elizabeth Warren is the one who, when I threw this question out to my friends, I think everyone said that was the unanimous, whether they were Republican or Democrat. They all said, of course, Elizabeth Warren is on your list, and it is kind of a inclusion to put her there.
But what makes her so interesting? Is it the fact that she might run for president?
No.
Is it the impact she might have on other candidates?
Whether or not she runs, she really is someone who's generating a lot of excitement right now, who really, I think, is giving people, there has been so much unhappiness, not just on the left, but I think in the country as a whole, with the aftermath of the economic meltdown and the fact still, after all these years, that those who really did bring our economy to the edge of collapse were never held accountable. And I think that her really very populist message just resonates with a lot of people, even beyond the Democratic Party. But within her party, there certainly is so much excitement for her that whether she runs or she doesn't run, she really is the voice that a lot of people are so happy to hear on the subject in particular of income equality, which is so front and center right now.
If she did think about running, is there any possibility that she could overcome the huge opposition she would certainly get from the banks, because she's been such a vocal opponent of the banks?
That's such an interesting thing to think about, because really you have seen both, you could really argue that both parties in Congress have been heavily supported by the financial, by the banking industry, by Wall Street. So someone who, really is not obviously not looking for that sort of support is going to get a lot of opposition. On the contrary, I think is, kind of refreshing to a lot of people. Now, whether she could overcome that, a lot of people thought that Barack Obama didn't stand a chance because he didn't appear in the beginning. This is in '08, of course, I mean,
Right.
To have the kind of fundraising acumen and history that Hillary Clinton did.
Right.
And that turned out pretty well for him, at least on that front.
It did. Elizabeth Warren strikes me as someone who is very wonky. She's obviously incredibly bright, and Hillary Clinton also very bright. If we ended up with those two women in a primary fight, I think a lot of people would look forward to those debates.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely. And of course, Elizabeth Warren has said time and again, I've lost track of how many times she said she's not running.
Right.
But I think a lot of people rightly believe that it would be a good thing for Hillary Clinton's candidacy, that she's going to be, kind of flabby if she comes into the contest without having any serious competition in the primary. And yet, I still think that you hear more and more people lately, David Brooks even making the case that actually she's not just someone who's going to whip Clinton into shape potentially, but could actually win the nomination. And I don't think that's far-fetched.
Very interesting. Okay.
This whole idea of inevitability, I remember again in '08 how, when you say back then, I'm not positive that's how it's going to go, that was regarded as a really crazy statement. And yet here again, you hear people saying, of course that's how it's going to go. But politics is rarely that linear.
That's right. And you already have talked about the difficulty of making those predictions.
Right.
We all need to be a little bit cautious. So that's two people. Who is number 3 on your list? And are we, I hope we're showing the pictures, because we have photographs of each of the people on your list. Next is a new senator-elect from Iowa.
Next is Joni Ernst, the self-described castrator of hogs. And the first...
She's already interesting, right?
Right. And the first, her ads were I guess you'd say a scream. And
a squeal, I think.
There you go. She is also the first female military veteran to serve in the Senate. Mm-hmm. And she just today said that she is not going to endorse, that she is not going to take a position prior to the Iowa caucuses on which of her fellow Republicans should get the nomination, should win. But I think she really is going to get a ton of attention. Here's somebody who really has kind of a flair for the colorful, even Sarah Palin-esque soundbite. I mean, her speeches are wildly entertaining, and I think she speaks in a very different way than we're used to hearing, I think particularly from women in the Senate, Republican women, I mean, in particular.
Talk a little bit about her campaign against Bruce Braley, whom she defeated, I think, fairly handily. We thought that was going to be a close race, but in the end,
she did.
She really was over the top, but the campaign got pretty ugly.
It was a very negative campaign. Well, when you're going to a campaign that's that expected to be that close, I think is going to be that way, but that's where I compare her to Sarah Palin. I mean, she came out very strong, very negative, and he was too.
Right.
I mean, it was a nasty fight,
right. and expensive.
Yes,
right? Almost $40 million, I think, between the two of them.
As they are now, but she hit on all the conservative themes. I think she. With the exception of Fisher, is probably more conservative than any of the other Republican women in the Senate. And I think it's so interesting that to be elected as a woman in Congress who's a Republican, you already have to be more conservative than your male counterpart, because
why
voters have this, I just think, there's been a lot of study on this. I think it's so interesting. Voters have a bias that women are actually more liberal. So to convince the Republican voter that you as a woman are sufficiently conservative to be elected, you do actually have to be even more conservative than your male counterpart.
I feel like her military background must have been very helpful. She came across very tough.
And her rhetoric was very tough, as we've said. But, she came out against she was very strong against Obamacare. She was very, talked a lot about the social issues and about...
And she is socially conservative.
She is.
Yeah, and that may be one of the things that makes her very interesting. How do you think she'll be a newcomer to the Senate? What are the issues that you think she's going to put front and center? And will she be introducing legislation? She's already on a number of committees. What do you see her actually doing?
I think that's hard to say, and maybe even unfair to put on her, but because of her kind of star power and because of all the attention on her state in a caucus year, I think she will be weighing in a very prominent way, maybe more than she'll be at the center of legislation so early on.
Right. Makes sense. We're going to move on to number 4 on your list, a little bit of a lighter topic. And in fact, this is, and we'll show the picture in a minute, not just one person, but 2 people.
Well, I wanted to include the Obama girls, Sasha and Malia, who I think have distinguish themselves in texting less in public than perhaps any American teenager we could think of. I think that these girls are so much better behaved than not just a lot of young people, but maybe even some adults.
Right.
And
of course, what made them so interesting recently was the turkey kerfuffle.
Right.
Can you explain what happened?
Well, where they were criticized by a Republican aide, now former Republican aide, for dressing like teenagers and behaving in a very authentic way, maybe appropriately not that excited about kind of one of our silliest annual traditions, the turkey pardon.
Right.
So maybe next year they will come with big smiles, or maybe Dad and Mom will give them a pardon and they won't have to come to their last one.
Well, as the mother of 3 adults who once were teenagers, I can tell you I have been the subject of much eye rolling. It's just what happens.
It's what happens.
Yeah, and I agree with you. These girls have been in the White House for a long time, and it is not an easy thing. It's almost like growing up as American royalty, even though, and we can talk about this, I think the U.S. press has gone fairly lightly on them. I know they've been asked to give the girls privacy, and for the most part, is it your sense that they've done that?
I think so. I mean, and that too is a long tradition and a better one, I think, than the turkey pardon. I mean, I think it's only, it's one of the rules of politics that you leave the family alone, and especially children. There was so much pushback that should have been completely expected to taking on kids.
Right. And it'll be interesting, maybe not next year. I mean, the girls are young, 13 and 16, but it'll be interesting to see 5 years down the road, 10 years, where they end up, because we've watched the Bush daughters and Chelsea Clinton take various adult roles, some of them political, and so it'll be very fun to watch where these two end up. Now, the last person on your list, because I have behind-the-scenes information, I happen to know that this was a late add to the list. Do you want to talk about Senator Ted Cruz?
Well, I don't want Senator Cruz to think he's a token on this list, because he happens to have been the only man I mentioned, and maybe I did feel a little bad about that initially.
I would have been perfectly happy, just so you know, with a list of 5 all-females.
But, I feel pretty confident that in the coming year he's going to find new creative ways to alienate his fellow Republicans. And he's beloved by the base. So he is an interesting guy to watch. There's no question.
He is interesting. The president made a big move today toward normalization with Cuba.
Right.
And, of course, Senator Cruz is Cuban-American. His father was Cuban. Does that make him more interesting? Less interesting? I think he's not happy about what the president has done.
I was listening to Senator Rubio's very critical remarks today and wondering that of him. People have been saying that he was kind of looking for relevance, and maybe the president has given him kind of a gift in, putting him in the forefront, at least for a minute, as this is announced and as it's going to be sorted out. I don't really think so, though. I don't think that that's a major issue there certainly continues to be disagreement about it. But I think that even on the Republican side, there is still a lot of feeling that it is time to normalize relations. And that there's something to the president's argument that we tried isolating them for 54 years, and that hasn't
keep
borne
doing the
fruit.
same thing, and you shouldn't expect some different outcome.
It sort of reminded me of an anonymous in-law of mine who's been in therapy all his adult life, every single day, and he feels he's pretty much on the brink of a breakthrough.
Okay, well, we'll see. We'll see if this makes any difference. At least with Cuba. So looking at the list overall, is there anything these people have in common? I mean, what does it take to be a really interesting person in a town full of interesting people?
I think that what these people have in common is that they're breaking the mold in some way or other. And I did want to add sort of a runner-up to the list in Senator Claire McCaskill.
Oh,
workhorse.
absolutely.
Who was really the force behind a law that I think is going to be passed next year in doing the work to get the law prepared on changing the response to sexual assault on college campuses. Mm-hmm. I know we recently had this terrible disaster of a Rolling Stone story on an alleged assault at the University of Virginia. Mm-hmm. But even though the story, I can't really, the story was a disaster, but the issue is very real and very serious. Right. And my hat is off to Senator McCaskill and so many others who have, on both sides of the aisle, mm-hmm. who have done a lot of work on this issue and on what I think really is one of the most promising possible solutions and possible paths to getting colleges to take how they deal with these allegations more seriously. Because
can you
what
talk
they're
a little bit about the bill and what it would do?
The main thing that they're asking is that there be a fine, a federal fine on institutions that fail to live up to their responsibility under Title IX by mishandling these allegations. Mm-hmm. Currently, the only thing that can happen to you is kind of a nuclear option where all Title IX federal funds are withdrawn from the school, right. which would put any college out of business immediately.
Right. Too punitive.
So that is not going to happen ever. Mm-hmm. So, as Senator McCaskill said at one of the hearings, that would be like me as a mother saying, if you don't do her children, if you don't do what I want, I'm never speaking to you again. That's never going to happen, right. So that's a completely empty threat. Mm-hmm. Whereas under this bill, were it to pass, there would be, I think what they're thinking of is a 1% of the operating budget of the school, which is enough to really hurt, right. but not enough to put a school under. So with the thought being that could be something that could really change behavior and that could really get the attention of schools.
Yeah, and it's such an interesting issue because schools...
Very important.
Schools will argue that it's very difficult to respect the rights of women who have been victimized, who are survivors of sexual assault, and also protect the rights of men who may be accused of that. And
right.
finding that balance and those strategies is not an easy thing.
Although it's not easy, I don't want to say that it is,
right.
but I think that the failure to take the allegations seriously is really just the flip side of the failure to give adequate weight to any response from the accused, because the answer to both things is a serious investigation right. and following the facts. So you can't, just as you can't assume that the accused is guilty, and you can't assume that the accuser is wrong. You just follow. It's pretty simple in that you do a serious investigation and find out where the facts lead. And I really think that if they stuck to that, they would have a lot fewer problems. And when I see this, people have called it an overreaction. In some cases, this affirmative consent idea, for example, where you're supposed to verbally give consent right. over and over and over. Right. I'm not sure that's workable in the real world. I think what we really need...
It's hard to imagine that really happening.
We really need... I don't think that's an overreaction. I think that's just another way of not taking a serious issue very seriously. Just investigate, forget the silliness of he said, she said, which really just means we don't want to know.
Right. Well, it will be interesting looking ahead to see if this bill does pass. You said it's got support on both sides of the aisle.
That's right.
So
and
anything
Charles
can happen.
Grassley, Republican, who's going to be chairing the Judiciary Committee, has promised that it will come up and will be acted on this year. So that's very helpful.
Okay. So I noticed that included on your list, no Hillary Clinton.
I didn't, but I thought that's because this is a Washington list, and she's going to be running so hard, she is not going to be in Washington that much in the coming year. She will definitely continue to be a huge story, obviously.
Yes, right, and a very interesting person. Well, thank you. This was a great discussion, and I look forward to seeing where all of these predictions go.
Me too.
Melinda Henneberger of the Washington Post, thank you so much. Many thanks to our viewers and supporters for joining us in the Evelyn Y. Davis studios at the National Press Foundation, where we are making good journalists even better.